In the year of 2025, trade relationships and global economy, and surely those are the two most fascinating elements for the entire world. It's not just about the trade relationships with the foes or with the allies. And more importantly, for the global citizens, the question that we need to understand is, how do we understand this global economic shift? It's not about the shift that happened only without the short period, but for the bigger picture. Now today, looking at the countries such as US, China, and more countries in Latin America, people are very concerned about this economic agenda. And surely we know that today, when we talk about this economic agenda, we cannot talk about the topic without political influence. And take the country of Argentina, for example. Now today, how do we understand the uncertainty? And what about under the current leader? What does that say about the future for the country? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who's the Dr. Maria Murillo. Dr. Murillo is the author of Labor Unions, Partisan Coalitions, and Market Reforms in Latin America. And her research focuses on distributive politics in Latin America, including labor politics and labor regulations, public utility reform, education reform, and economic policy more generally. Well, Dr. Murillo, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, absolutely, Doctor. It's such an honor to have you on our show. As I mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because of this amazing article that you wrote, it's entitled Milei's Tightrope Act, Why the Argentine President Will Struggle to Exploit His New Mandate. Now, let's talk about the content in your article. I want to read something to you that you wrote. I want to get your further reaction. This is what you wrote, and I quote, Milei's economic adjustment program, which entailed massive spending cuts and layoffs, had brought hardships to many Argentines at this moment, end quote. Now, Professor, from your perspective, we know that today, especially we look at this economic agenda for the nation of Argentina. Why do you say that the current economic adjustment brought hardship to the citizens in this country, and how complicated it is for us to understand that? Your thoughts?
Yes, thanks. So you need to understand, to have a broader picture. So Argentina has struggled with economic crisis at least since the 1970s. And those have normally included shortages of foreign currency. That means that we import more than we export, Argentina, and cannot pay for it, right? And the government has relied on debt to try to pay for these shortages. In fact, Argentina is currently the largest debtor of the IMF because it cannot go to private bond markets. Their country risk is so high that people would not buy yet Argentine bonds. So it only can rely on public lenders like the IMF, the World Bank, and the U.S. Treasury, and China as well. So I think that's a context that's kind of coming before Milei. And the country was also divided, very polarized, like the United States, in two sides. Those two sides were the Peronists and the anti-Peronists. The party that represents the anti-Peronists has been shifting over time since the 1940s and 50s, when the Peronists emerged, which was a kind of welfarist party, but then it shifted. It's a very ideologically fluid party. In the 90s, it shifted to neoliberalism. In the 2000s, shifted back to the left. So both the Peronist and the anti-Peronist center-right coalition had failed to resolve the economic crisis of Argentina, which at least since 2012, Argentina has not grown. The GDP now is fairly similar to 2012, right? So that's a long period of time. And during this period, inflation levels were very high. And so when Milei was elected, it was 2 years ago in 2023, the voters were coming from a Peronist government, there was an anti-Peronist government or like a center-right government, then a Peronist government, and inflation was continuing. Nobody could solve it. So in 2023, this outsider emerged, who's a libertarian economist. And people kind of were so tired that they decided to try. And there was a three-way election, presidential election. He was one of the three candidates. The other two were the traditional center-right party and the Peronist candidate. And he received a third of the vote. Because in Argentina, with a third of the vote, he was not the most voted. The Peronist was the most voted, but he didn't get enough votes to be elected president. There was a need of a runoff election. And in the runoff election, Milei received 56% of the votes. So why was that? That was because people were tired, had already tried with the traditional parties and said, okay, this guy promised, hardship, but there will be light at the end of the tunnel. Right, things are going to improve. And this kind of happened with regards to inflation. When he was inaugurated, inflation was at 200% annually. And currently it's about 30% annually, which is not low for world standards, but for Argentine standards, it changes the life of people. And that has reduced poverty just because prices are not skyrocketing. Now, how he did to reduce the inflation was by dramatically reducing the public deficit. And that implied firing more than 10% of public employees, basically reducing the real value of pension for pensioners, of public sector salaries, university professors, teachers, doctors, everybody working in the public sector, stopping all public works, so there's no construction, roads, nothing. So that certainly reduced the spending of the government. The government stopped printing money, and that reduced inflation. But it caused hardship because the other thing that the government did was to put the interest rate very high. So economic activity suffered. Now, even with all of this, the government was facing difficulties to defend the value of the peso. Why? Because there's no credibility on Argentina, right? It defaulted so many times. We know that this happens all the time. So in April of this year, the government received another IMF credit by $20 billion, which the US had really pushed the IMF to do it, plus other credits from World Bank and other banks. Still in September, so the government, in March, was hopeful that he was going to do well in the midterm elections. Milei had a very small legislative coalition because his party was new and he only got a third of the vote in the first round. This is a federal country. He didn't even have candidates in all provinces in 2023. He was expecting to enlarge his legislative coalition, and that would make legislation easier. But some provinces, this is a federal country, so there's both federal elections and provincial elections. And some provinces do not have concurrent elections. That means that their elections are earlier than the federal elections. In those provincial elections, Milei's party didn't do well, did poorly. And most importantly, in September, the largest province, which is also the largest electoral district, where 40% of the country's population live, had these provincial elections for mayors, for provincial legislators. And Milei's party lost by a 13-point margin to the Peronists. And that produced a run on the peso. Because everybody was like, oh my God, he's not going to win the midterms. What's going to happen with all the policies that he had been implementing? And so he had to rely on the US, basically, to defend the value of the peso. The US Treasury approved a currency swap for 20 billion, of which around 2 billion were already used to buy pesos and defend the value of the currency. That put the pressure on the peso down. People become a little bit less stressed. And I think on the day of the election, he surprised everyone, I would say even himself, by receiving 41% of the vote at the national level. And part of it is people rewarded him for having put inflation down. Voters were afraid of more instability. There were so many crises in Argentina before that the run on the peso also produced fear. And so continue betting on him was the safest option. And the fact that he had U.S. support showed that he at least would have someone to help him. So I think these were crucial issues in explaining the support in the midterm elections that has actually enlarged his legislative coalition.
Well, Professor, again, it's fascinating just to listen to how you specifically explain the complication of Milei's election results and also how he was able to stand out and begin because of this economic ambition and ready to reform for the country. But again, I want to keep on going back to your writing. This is something that quite stunning for all of us to read, is to say that in order for Milei to advance the reforms, he must build a broader coalition capable of navigating a fragmented national Congress. Again, Professor, you mentioned that today, for example, we look at the intricacy of the politics in America. Building a coalition, it seemed almost impossible. I mean, again, reaching the agreement across the aisles, it seems is beyond imagination. But for someone like Milei, again, you are the expert, correct me if I'm wrong, to build a broader coalition, why do you think it was so crucial and critical for Milei to take such approach, and how successful was he able to reach the goal by using such political, or even we call it economic strategy? Your thoughts?
Yes, so it's different from the US in the sense that in the US you have a two-party system with quite strong partisan discipline. We saw only 8 Democrats defected from the shutdown. That used to be the case in Argentina, but it's not the case anymore. It's first we have proportional representation electoral system. So there's always been many parties, and even parties that only exist at the provincial level, provincial parties, like as if you had state level parties, which doesn't happen in the United States. So Congress is very fragmented. He had a tiny legislative caucus. In 2023, he elected 50-something seats of a 37 seats of a 250 lower house. So very tiny, and 7 senators of a 72 upper house. 72 seats upper house. So very small. Now he enlarged both of them. And the fact that it was so small was crucial, because when he looked like he was going to lose the election, and in particular his popularity was coming down, what happened is that even people who had supported him in his original reforms in 2023 defected and joined the Peronists, and they passed laws that increased public spending. He vetoed these laws, and 3 of these laws, these vetoes were overridden. You need to have 2/3 to do that, right? So he needed at least a third to protect his vetoes. Now he has more than a third of his own representatives in both chambers, of his own legislators in both chambers. And the Peronists do not have a majority anymore. And in the middle, between him and the Peronists, there's very many parties, which are either provincial parties, some of them are center-right parties, some of them governors that could be, center-right or center-Peronists that need resources and could vote for him. So there's many different parties that he can attract to his coalition to get lost. The main issue here, he wants to pass a labor reform. He has not been able to pass the budget. So far, he has basically reproduced the budget from year to year. So, but the main issue is that some of these legislators want staff for their provinces, right? That's what they would be asking in return. So the question is, what would be the cost of their support? And the more popular he is, probably the lower the cost, because the voters in these provinces supported Milei. But if his popularity suffers, it would be much more expensive. And that could affect the fiscal, account. And so to what extent he would be able, for instance, he stopped all public works. The governors want public works, right? So what would be the cost of this is an issue, especially because Argentina needs to access to private bond markets, and the creditors are looking at the fiscal deficit as a crucial indicator. The other crucial indicator is what will happen with exchange rate policies.
Professor, when we look at this political atmosphere around the globe, of course, we have to bring the elephant in the room into our conversation, who is the sitting U.S. President Donald Trump. I mean, again, it's no surprise that we've seen during numerous occasions the Milei either visited President Trump in the White House or even Milei show up during the campaign season to strongly advocate for Donald Trump's economic and also political ambition. Now, again, in the article that you mentioned, that President Trump promised to make America great again. Of course, this is a slogan that has not been changed since 2016. But someone like Milei that seemed to buy into this model and also echo exactly what President Trump said, but change America into the nation of Argentina. So from your perspective, again, Professor, from this economic standpoint and also from this political standpoint, that you even mentioned, you wrote in the article, the Milei's campaign galvanized not only the traditional anti-Peronist coalition of educated and well-off voters, but also younger and poorer Argentines. So how do we understand the similarity of Donald Trump and Milei at this moment? And why do you think that for someone like Milei was able to attract the voters for the younger generation, for the poor, circles, and also even the traditionally ones who used to support the Peronists? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so here there are two different things. One is the geopolitics of it. So Milei, from very early on, even when the president of the United States was Joe Biden, aligned with Trump. He participated in campaign events. He's part of CPAC. And he used this Make Argentina Great Again campaign slogan. Very, very strong geopolitical alignment with not just Trump, but with the whole kind of conservative movement around the world, but especially with Donald Trump. I think he's not the only Latin American leader who has done that. Bukele in El Salvador has also aligned himself. But what Milei did is he did it, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, he did it before, very, very strong. And I think that was crucial for the U.S. bailout in the sense that the U.S. has never done something like this before with a country that is a developing country, has never bought, it has bought euros, it has bought yens, but these are, crucial allies to the United States. Argentina doesn't even have a lot of trade with the United States. It's not really a trading partner, has not been a traditional strong ally historically of the United States. But for geopolitical reasons and this kind of ideological relation, the U.S. had decided to defend the value of the peso and invest $20 billion in the middle of the shutdown. So I think that shows the importance of ideology in the thinking of U.S. policy. And in fact, if you think of U.S. policy towards Latin America, you could say that friends get support like Milei and enemies get bombs like, Maduro in Venezuela. So that's one issue, I think, the U.S. Relation to Latin America. The young vote, it's again a world trend. The young people are the most affected by economic crisis, unemployment all over the world, and they have been drifting to new options, to outsiders. And outsiders in the United States could be Trump or Mandani. And in the case of Argentina, the outsider was Milei. And they supported Milei because they thought, we have no future. This is someone who's promising there would be a future that's better for us. Now, what's interesting is between the 2023 election and the 2025 election of this year, the composition of his vote, we don't know at the individual level, but if we look at the ballot, the districts level, right? we can find that there has been a change in the vote. So his vote now is the most traditional anti-Peronist vote. He has added already in the second round all the vote of the center-right. So I think now he does better in districts that have lower levels of poverty compared to what he did in 2023. So maybe some of these poor voters he lost, and he won more of the well-off, more educated voters that were also afraid of his style, right? He's very aggressive. He uses vulgarities, things like that those voters were resistant to.
Well, but Professor, you mentioned two characters. One is Donald Trump. The other one is newly elected New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani. But those two people are very much different. Donald Trump is a strong advocate for capitalism. Mamdani is a believer, or it's a non-believer of capitalism. So my next question to you is, how do you think that Milei is balancing the global view, or even look at this economic agenda by looking at the two people that you just mentioned? Remember, keep in mind, during the campaign season of Mamdani, President Trump continued to call Mamdani as a communist. And of course, Mamdani, regardless what people address him, he wore the title of democratic socialist. But meanwhile, he's not a believer of capitalism. He's not a believer of billionaires. So how do you think that someone like Milei is balancing the view by looking at those two significant, complete different characters?
So there's two different things. One is the voters and the other are the leaders. Milei is completely aligned with Donald Trump. He only believes in capitalism. He hates communists. He accuses everybody of being a communist. Very similar to Trump, like 100% almost. So he hates he hates Mamdani. He had said, spoke against, and so on and so forth. But what I was referring to was about young voters, and the fact that young voters in many countries of the world are suffering the lack of the expense of the difficulties for housing, of finding a job, of starting families. And I think that's an issue. They might look for different solutions, and that depends on the context. In the case of New York, the context, favor Mamdani, but young voters have also voted for Trump when he was elected. And in fact, there are a lot of Mamdani voters that have voted for Trump, not maybe the young voters, but the Latino and African American voters. There was a shift. So I think it's more about of people thinking, okay, the status quo is not good. I want change. Traditional politicians have not been able to deliver change. Let's see who promised something new. And that something new could be right-wing or left-wing. I think people are just trying. It's not that they're ideologically so strong on the one side. It's that they want their problems to be solved. And they want a new solution because the prior ones didn't work for them.
Professor, I have one more question to ask before letting you go. Again, my last question I want to ask, let's bring another country into our conversation, which is China. Sitting U.S. President Donald Trump recently quickly wrapped up a trip in Asia. Again, he did not go to China, but he was able to meet the Chinese president, the Japanese prime minister, and also the South Korean president. Now, despite all the political differences, China continued to play a critical role for this international economic stage or international economic agenda. And meanwhile, Milei has been dancing on this idea that to get closer to China or to keep a distance away from China. So I want to hear your final thoughts. How do we assess Milei's attitude towards China today? Meanwhile, we continue to look at this economic competition between US and China at this moment. Your final thoughts.
Yes, so China is a crucial trading partner of Argentina. So Brazil and China are the main trading partners of Argentina. This is true of most of South America, right? This is where people sell their exports. So the relationship, Milei during the campaign criticized China strongly, like Bolsonaro had done. But then after being inaugurated as president, became much more pragmatic because Argentina needs China. Argentina needs China as a trading partner. China has already provided a bailout for Argentina, a currency swap under Cristina Kirchner, a Peronist president, of 10,000 billion that the president prior to Milei activated 5 billion, but Milei renewed the swap. He didn't cancel it, right? So he has been very pragmatic in its relationship with China. China has a space base in the south of Argentina. Nothing has been done regarding that. The U.S. has not seemingly required any change in policy towards China, to the extent to which Argentina aligns very strongly with the United States ideologically and in Latin America. So on Venezuela, on all of these issues, Argentina has aligned very strongly with the United States. And so I think the U.S. wants an ally in the region. Argentina is the largest economy that's allied to the U.S. because Brazil under Lula and Mexico under Sheinbaum, although Sheinbaum has a very close relationship, are more center-left, and so they are not aligned ideologically. So they need Milei for that reason. But Argentina, and we saw that with Bolsonaro as well, has been quite pragmatic because its economic dependence on China, it's pretty significant.
Well, again, Professor, it's such a fascinating conversation, especially we look at the complication, the intricacy of the political games, not only in the US, in China, but also in the nation of Argentina. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Maria Murillo. Again, Professor Murillo is the author of the book called Labor Unions, Partisan Coalitions, and Market Reforms in Latin America. Her research strongly focuses on distributive politics in Latin America, including labor politics and labor regulations, public utility reform, education reform, and economic policy more generally. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out Professor's this amazing article, which is entitled Milei's Tightrope Act, Why the Argentine President Will Struggle to Exploit His New Mandate. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to explore the fascinating topics in the nation of Argentina. So thank you so much for doing this.